Hello, everybody. This is John Katz at Beat the Prosecution. I'm a criminal defense and DUI defense lawyer here in Fairfax, Northern Virginia. I am beyond excited that I have two amazing guests today. We have Jonathan Moreno. He's an expert in psychodrama. His dad, Jael Moreno, founded and started psychodrama. And back for a return visit is Christopher Floor, the first person I've ever interviewed outside of my law firm over a year ago on this podcast, who was here with whom at the time? Don Clarkson, one of the students of Jael Moreno, who also was a student and or collaborator with Jonathan Moreno. Jonathan, of course, has a great first name. I go by John. He goes by Jonathan. Jonathan Moreno, please introduce yourself.
Well, thanks first of all to you, John, for having me on the podcast, and it's great to also be on with Chris. So meeting you both for the first time in cyberspace. I am an emeritus professor of bioethics at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm a philosopher by training. I've been in medical education since 1979 when I arrived at George Washington University. Um, and since then have been kicked out of a bunch of medical schools, trying to make themselves more respectable in my absence. Most recently, about 18 years at Penn. And I continue to resist the R word. Uh, so I am not retired. I am, as the University of Pennsylvania lawyers say, I am severed. I am severed. Isn't that scary? I'm severed from the University of Pennsylvania, but continue to write and give talks and be on podcasts like this one, which will be a lot of fun.
Okay, and Christopher Floor, before he introduces himself, you met him if you've been listening to this podcast since early last year. You've heard me talk about him a lot. He's a great friend. I've known him since 1999. Every once a month. This is not open to prosecutors. This is not open to people on the dark side. Every month he gathers at his office, hybrid, to choose one lawyer's case and help bring it closer to quantum leaps towards victory. He went all the way with me, Chris, to visit a murder defendant who I couldn't get out on bond. He drove all the way out there to meet with this man with me. Now, I'm not encouraging other people to think they can get away with this with Chris, but he is a very important person in my life. Chris, what do you have to say to everybody?
Well, I'm glad to be back on here. I'm honored, and I'm truly honored to be able to sit in and participate with Jonathan's interview. His dad and the work that they've both done has been life-changing for me, and I continue to benefit from my work with psychodrama and reenactment when we don't have a psychodramatist working with us. I am a former public defender from Brooklyn, New York. Grew up there on the lovely Long Island, and I have been a Marylander for over 27 years now. And I run a small solo practice currently. I'm very, very fortunate to have a brand new team member of Jana Peterson, who's a recent UB Law grad and who's awaiting her bar results. So that's exciting for me. And I primarily practice criminal defense. I focus a good bit of my work on the mentally ill, folks with disabilities, autism, and drug and alcohol addiction. But very, very glad to be back. And you are an important person in my life. And it's weird for us to go this long without you saying Christopher Floorman at one point. So I'm feeling a little bit off. So
Well, you didn't call me Catsman
and
either.
I will call you Catsman right now. So,
Okay, well,
anyway,
before
but
we
this
go
is about
further,
Jonathan today. So
but
thank you.
yes, before we go to Jonathan Moreno, Christopher Floorman, what I do want to tell everyone is Chris has this great combination of being a badass who doesn't pull punches, but he comes across as such this nice guy. And we have this New York area background. I grew up in Southern Connecticut, near New York, and he grew up wherever it was. near New York, but he seems to have this more polished approach to it than me. And so sometimes in a tense situation, if I say, is it maybe not a good idea to say what I'm about to say to really give my true feelings to somebody, I might say, what would Chris Floyd say or do? With that, Jonathan Moreno, what is psychodrama? How was it developed? Who developed it? And what makes you a person who has spent so many decades and thousands of hours of your life with this?
Well, first I got to say, we can triangulate about origins because I grew up in the Hudson Valley. I went to Hofstra, so Chris knows the culture of Long Island, and I worked at Downstate Medical School in Flatbush,
Mm.
which, speaking of Brooklyn, um, many of my conversations at my former employer, SUNY Health Science Center at Brooklyn, otherwise known as Downstate, started with my physician colleagues yelling at me about something. Uh, this is not an unusual way for a conversation to start in Brooklyn. We usually became friends. So, John, I'm going to your last of the several questions. I was an accident of birth. I did not plan to be a resident of a mental hospital. Um, the pediatricians say choose your parents wisely. So apparently chose two rather colorful people to be my parents. My father, as you both well know, and maybe some of your listeners and viewers know, was a graduate of the University of Vienna Medical School in 1917. His diploma was signed by Franz Josef, not long before he was chased out. And Therefore, I'm not 115 years old. I'm getting there. But I was born in 1952. You do the math. When my father was 63. Uh, Now you may ask, how old was my mother? She was only 60. I'm kidding. She was 28 years younger. They met around 1941. He had been in this country since 1925. He developed psychodrama in Vienna. Apparently, you didn't have to know much or learn much in medical school in those days because he did a lot of things in Vienna other than studying medicine. Um, for example, in 1914 and 1915, he was a medic at a refugee camp for the Austro-Hungarian army, actually at two refugee camps. They pulled him out of medical school for that purpose. So how many people can say that they, had a relative who was in the Austro-Hungarian army? Uh, he then, after medical school, started a journal where he published some very famous people in Vienna at that time. There was a lot of intellectuals. Franz Kafka was going back and forth between Vienna and Prague, but there are people like you may have heard of, like Martin Buber, who my father was the first person to publish Martin Buber
Wait,
uh,
he knew Buber?
in his journal. Yes, now Buber was older, um, and in fact, he did not start by publishing pieces like I and Thou, which you educated guys know about. Martin Buber started by publishing Hasidic folk tales, and he published the first ones in my dad's journal in the late teens. In fact, I have a copy of a letter that my father wrote to Buber in my office here, my study, specifying that we are accepting your piece, Mr. Herr Buber. We're going to send you a check for the honorarium. Publish it, but you should cash it very quickly because of the inflation, which was rampant after World War I in Austria, of course. Uh, Now, there is a professor in Vienna who believes that actually Martin Buber's I and Thou was inspired by JL, by my dad. Uh, I'm going to let that speak for itself. I don't know that, but I wouldn't be surprised. So, origins of psychodrama. When my dad was growing up in Vienna, probably when he was around 17, 18 years old, getting ready for university, he would hang around the parks, the gardens of Vienna. Beautiful city, as you may know, with beautiful gardens. And he noticed that the kids were playing games that involved role playing. Mom and dad and I don't know, cowboys and Indians, which I did, not in fashion anymore, right? Uh, and he realized that what they were doing was not only exercising their imagination and spontaneity and creativity, they were also working out who they were kind of through these roles. Um, 7 years later or so, 8 years later, he started an impromptu theater he called the Theater of Spontaneity. This is in Vienna. There's now a plaque on the building that you can see where he had his theater, his very small theater. And he challenged people not to play the roles that playwrights wrote for them, but to create their own roles, to play their own roles, to play themselves, as you well know, to play other people in their circle, in their drama. Uh, you guys have been educated in role playing with your clients and perhaps with the opposing counsel to role play, to reverse roles with those in the drama of the legal setting, which is a very dramatic, right? Very dramatic setting. It's a theater in itself, as we know. So, among the people that he worked with and really discovered in his theater of spontaneity around 1920, 1921 in Vienna was a very adorable little young man that my father named. Do you know the answer to this one?
Oh, I'm embarrassed.
Peter Lorre.
Whoa!
It's a matter of record that he
Uh,
discovered Peter Lorre, whose name was Ladislaw Lowenstein, and he said that will not fit on a theater marquee. I can tell you more about the young Peter Lorre if you like, but he took this creepy character that he developed in my father's Theater of Spontaneity into Fritz Lang's famous film M and Casablanca. I mean, anybody who's seen Casablanca, which is one of the great films ever made,
yeah.
Peter Lorre is in hardly any of the movie. He steals every scene. So that's the origins of psychodrama. Now, I'm saying a lot of words here, so forgive me. I'll say one more paragraph, not too long. My father tried to make a go of it in the theater, but he discovered both in Vienna and in New York that audiences were not accustomed to spontaneity, to spontaneous theater. Audiences are trained with a certain set of expectations about the dramatic arc, beginning, a middle, and an end. Spontaneous theater, as you know, is not like that. It's kind of herky-jerky. It can be boring, it can be shocking, it can be thrilling, it can be boring again. Um, so he just couldn't make a go of it, but he realized, do well with a psychiatric setting. People with emotional problems, normal people like us, what he called normotics, as well as people with really good psychotic delusions, can express themselves, act out in a controlled setting in ways that can be educational for themselves and other people in the group and cathartic. So, long story short, in 1925, he comes to the US. Lots of reasons he came here I can talk about if you like. And, psychodrama is now a global movement. He died in 1974, and I was nearly 22. Um, my mother took over, as you know, also really more of a therapist than my father was really a man of the theater. My mother was really the therapist. Uh, and it's a global effort. He was really the first person, I'll end here, I think, to challenge psychoanalysis. There's a famous story, might even be true. In 1912 or so, he's attending a dream analysis lecture by Freud, dream interpretation, and afterwards the young men, all men, line up, and Freud goes down the row, and he gets to my father, and he says, "And so your name is Moreno." He says, "Oh, Moreno, what are you doing?" And supposedly my father said, "Professor Moreno, Professor Freud, I begin where you leave off." What do you mean? He said, "Well, you destroy people's dreams by analyzing them. I give them the courage to dream again."
Yes,
Wow.
yes.
"I
Wow.
wish you luck," he said.
Mm.
Chris,
So,
jump in.
on you guys now. Come on, Chris. Give me something.
I'm curious, growing up in the family with both your mom and your dad being so, this was such a dedication, it sounded like, for them. Did they use that in parenting? Did you use that in conflict resolution within the family? That just kind of sparked into my head as I was thinking about it.
They did. Um, my mother tells a story, and I sort of vaguely remember this when I was maybe 5 or 6 years old, and I was eating my dinner, and she said, "Jonathan, why you eat dinner?" Well, I'm not really not hungry tonight. Maybe later, Mom. And she said, "Well, let's reverse roles." And so I went to sit in her chair at the dining room table, and she sat in mine. And uh, as Zerka, my mother, her name is Zerka, uh, I said, Jonathan, you don't need to eat dinner. So I exploited that role reversal for my. We did some of that. They did some of that. People ask me if I did it with my own kids. I have to say I didn't. Uh, wasn't exactly my thing. My parents really died working. I mean, quite literally on their deathbeds. I don't know anybody else exactly like that. Uh,
Mm.
and now that I'm sort of transitioned from being a full-time professor to being, as my stockbroker says, a full-time investor, uh, I'm struck by their total identification with their work. I don't really know anybody else like that.
Okay, so what year did your father come over here?
It came
Was
in
it
1925.
1925? So that's before he knew who Hitler was. So,
He claimed, and again, we can't fact check this, but as my one of my journalist friends says, that this story is too good to fact check. Um, he claims that when he took his impromptu theater group, his theater spontaneity group to Munich, that he did see Hitler giving a rally, because Munich was Hitler's favorite town. It's where he tried to lead his famous beer hall putsch that landed him in prison, in Landsberg prison for a while. And he said that he recognized him, he claimed, from a few years before when Hitler was impoverished after World War I and didn't get into art school, which is unfortunate. Please, we wish he'd have gotten admitted to art school. And he was painting picture postcards for a few pennies in the park. He claims that he recognized him from that, from seeing him in the park, which is entirely possible because we know he was doing that, Hitler was doing that. So, uh, this was a very fraught time um, in that part of the world. He also claims that he ran into Trotsky, who was in fact in Vienna, as he was in New York. Um, so Freud, Trotsky, Hitler. Who else? Who else can you run across in Vienna in the late 19 teens and early 1920s?
so what made your father decide to leave Austria, and where was it that he and your mom started psychodrama, and where did they and you take it from there?
Well, he came in 1925 to New York. He was 36 years old, so he wasn't a kid. He had his medical degree, but it was his younger brother who was the business head, William. William helped him with his visa. I believe that they went to Montreal to bribe a State Department official at the consulate to get an extended visa. This is how things were done. Uh, in fact, a few years later, a woman married him so that he could become a citizen. This is how things were done. We're talking a lot about immigration these days, right? People forget it wasn't always so regular. It was not good to be coming from that part of Europe in 1925. He couldn't have known that. In 1924, Congress passed a very restrictive immigration law to prevent people from Southern Eastern Europe for coming to the U.S. It was a time of eugenics, and the thought was that these Southern and Eastern people, these Italians, these Jews, would pollute the American race. I'm not exaggerating here. I teach this stuff, so this is the way people spoke. Also, the new uh, Austrian Republic had no clout, no power, and he was all. It was confusing because he was also not an Austrian citizen. He was Romanian. He had been born in Romania, so he was in a tough spot. But through these other informal means, he was able to stay in the U.S. But why did he come here is the question, John. That's complicated. Some of his friends and colleagues were going to Palestine to create the new settlement for Jews. Some of them, I think, were going to Russia. Russia seemed like a place of the future. There had been the Bolshevik Revolution, a lot of optimism in the early days uh, about the future of Russia. Um, he chose to come to the U.S. partly because he had a business opportunity. He and his Austrian girlfriend's brother had invented an audio recording device they called radio film. It was patented in Austria, and a company that later was purchased by RCA paid for his boat ticket, first class, which he was very proud of, to come to New York. Then he discovered when he got here that in order to go on with his relationship with the company, and by the way, my father could not screw in a light bulb. It was really his girlfriend's brother who was the inventor. He was a real, very clever, like Thomas Edison kind of guy working in a garage who created this audio recording system. One of a couple of hundred that were around at that time. My father discovered that to continue that relationship, he would have gone to Aurora, Ohio. Now, my dad had come from Vienna as a very sophisticated guy. He was not going to Ohio. He stayed in New York, developed a medical practice, got on his feet. And then within 10 years, he was a very well-established guy who was kind of famous. Do you know that he predicted the outcomes of heavyweight title fights? Do you know that story?
No, I don't know that. That would be pretty cool.
So there was an AP journalist who really liked his work. This is the early 1930s, and was going through divorce apparently, and my father helped him through his divorce emotionally. And he said, "Okay, Moreno, if you're so smart, can you predict the outcome of the Max Baer Joe Louis fight that's happening in 1935?" Sure, but you have to get me into the training camps. So he got him in, and he observed the interactions of the fighters, Max Baer and Joe Louis, with other people. He also noted that Max Baer had been in a film with Myrna Loy and had started an affair with Myrna Loy. And my father published this in the newspapers that Max Baer was distracted, that he wasn't focused. And his training camp kind of knew that. Joe Louis, on the other hand, was a straight ahead fighter. Nothing would stop Joe Louis. And you could see that he was a leader in his camp. He predicted that Joe Louis would win, and he did. 1935. I'm not making this up. You can look it up. He then became very popular with sports writers, and he was asked repeatedly to do this. So he did a number of fights. He predicted a number of fights for like the Brooklyn Eagle, for those old newspapers. He was syndicated. And I think he was the first person to apply psychology in some loose way to sports. And I'll bet my father was not a gambler. I'll bet some people made money after they saw that this psychiatrist of all people was an accurate, right, predictor of heavyweight fights. I'm sure people made some money on him.
That's wild.
Yeah.
And at what point did he start doing the psychodrama? And I guess that was well before you were born.
Oh yeah. I mean, I mentioned his impromptu theater in Vienna. In 1931, he also tried that at Carnegie Hall. He worked with a number of actors in what was then called the group theater. Um, some of them might be familiar to you. One of them was a guy named John Garfield. So there were a lot of really famous actors. And there were all the whole Broadway was very intimate in those days, and as you know, the movie industry had not yet fully moved to LA. It mostly had, but not completely. So there were a lot of actors around, and he was working with actors to help to train them for their roles. Uh, and then one day he tried to do a psychodrama at Carnegie Hall. It didn't go well because the theater critics, again, they didn't get it, you know, didn't get spontaneity. So he saw that what we needed to do is work in psychodrama in psychiatry. So his younger brother helped him buy uh, at first about 11 acres in Beacon, New York, and he had a famous first. He had the mother of a famous actor as his first patient, a very wealthy woman named his patient was Franchot Tone, who you probably don't know who Franchot Tone was, but if you Google him, you'll see him in a lot of movies. And he was the king of Broadway. His wife at the time was somebody you have heard of, named Joan Crawford.
Yes.
Joan Crawford was the queen of Hollywood. He was the king of Broadway. No, marriage wasn't going well. And my father did marriage counseling with them, he wrote about it in the newspapers. Probably the first famous marriage counseling in psychodrama. Didn't work out so well. Apparently, she walked in on him in flagrante with somebody on backstage one day, and that was the end of that marriage. But it was psychodrama in a marriage. But before that, he had got a letter from a very powerful guy named Mr. Tone in upstate New York, whose wife was having alcohol problems, and Gertrude Franchot Tone. So my father said, "I'm happy to see her." My father was already getting famous by then. "I'm happy to see your wife, and send her to me here in Beacon, New York." So Gertrude comes in holding his book, his first big book called Who Shall Survive? And she's obviously a very intelligent woman. So he agrees to take her on as his student. Now remember, Mr. Tone, her husband, the father of Franchot, the actor, had wanted Gertrude to go to my father to be his patient because she had an alcohol problem. I have a feeling that my father ended up double dipping, that Mr. Tone was paying him to be the therapist for his wife, and Mrs. Tone was paying him to be her teacher. So we can argue about that. This is important, though, because when he had this land, 11 acres in Beacon, and a big building, he didn't have a psychodrama theater. And she donated the funds to build a psychodrama theater, the first one in the world. So then he started receiving mental patients, which he had 30 years of receiving mental patients from the late 30s to the late 60s. I can tell you about his favorites, people who had wonderful psychotic delusions that were terrific for psychodrama. Hitler's, Jesus figures. I can talk more about one of my favorites if you like later on. And it was a center for training people like you, lawyers, but also psychonauts, people who were just exploring questions about their lives, professors, physicians, clergy. Very few psychiatrists were willing to work seriously with people who believed in God because they were Freudian. And according to Freud, faith is neurotic. But my father was himself a God player. And so he was very happy to have these people play God in psychodrama.
Chris.
Yes, I'm fascinated here, and I don't want to wait. So when you said and threw out the line to us, do you want to hear what one of his favorite patients was? I'm all in.
This is a great story.
Okay.
I got to say, you're not supposed to say that before you tell a story, right? But I think you're going to like this story. So I always, we were in a separate building. We had 20 acres ultimately in Beacon. And it's gone now, basically. I mean, it's all been changed. There's buildings there, homes there now. But I saw the patients, and it was hard to keep a little boy away from the hospital, which was like a 5 minute walk down the dirt road from our house. So I knew who, when the patients were coming and going, I knew who they were. And they had recently admitted a young man. And so I was being driven home from school, which is sort of unusual, up one of the hills on our place. And I saw this young man who I knew was a new patient. And I waved at him. I think I was 8 or 9 years old. And I noticed something different. He was standing outside on a beautiful hill overlooking the property with a kind of a view about a mile away, a mile and a half away of the Hudson River through the trees. And I noticed that he had very dark hair, black hair. And I noticed also that he had black hair everywhere. And when I say everywhere, I mean I had never seen that before. So I waved, and then I saw that he was nude, and it was a beautiful day in the 70s. And there was nobody else around, you know. So years later, when I asked my mother about this, he said, yes, he was Jesus, and Jesus had to be nude because Jesus was pure. So, all right. Now, that's only the first part of the story. It gets better. Between our property was a stand of, and the next property was a stand of trees, not a very, but some maybe, I don't know, 20 yards of worth of trees. And Jesus, this young man, would walk around in the nude. So next door to us at that time, there was a novitiate, a convent, where young nuns would have to go to, prove themselves worthy of the discipline. So you know where this is going?
It's going somewhere fun.
My mother gets a call from the abbess one day. She says, Mrs. Moreno, some of the young women are very disturbed by this young man who's walking around unclothed. And my mother, now remember, he's Jesus, right? So my mother says, well, they don't have to look. They don't have to look.
Thank you for that, Jonathan. Thank you.
The true story. That is a true story.
Wow.
Well, somewhere along the road, Don Clarkson from the Charles College met your father in the early 60s, met you. Jerry Spence, who was had the Charles College start on his ranch, swore by psychodrama, which is a big part of the Charles College. What is the reason why I have not heard about you being involved with the Charles College? What was your involvement with Don Clarkson?
Well, with Don, I mean, I was a kid. I would think I was 12, 13 when Don, who's about 10 years older, I think, than I am. He shows up in Beacon with a number of other students uh, at the behest of a great therapist, the late Jim Ennis of St. Elizabeth's Hospital here in Washington. Um, so Don was one of Jim Ennis's favorites, and he comes to Beacon, and he spent some time in Beacon. I don't remember how much. I was doing my thing. I was a kid, I was junior high school and then high school, so I wasn't paying all that much attention. But I became very fond of Don right away. I will also say, by the way, there were very few people of color in the psychiatry world at that time, in the psychotherapy world, and so that was different. Uh, and I'm sure it was not so easy for Don. First of all, it was kind of a strange environment, right, with a lot of weird people doing psychodrama and mental patients. And you can tell the patients from the students, frankly. I mean, my father liked to mix it up. Uh, so that was pretty funny, I think, for Don. And then I got to know Don better in the mid 1970s when I was pretty much grown up, more or less, in my early 20s. Um, and you never heard about me had me at TLC because I mean, I've been a lifetime professor and I was busy. Now, Jerry, I will say, sent one of his books with a very sweet Inscription in the early 90s. But I was working in medical schools teaching medical ethics, and I wasn't going out to TLC. But I followed what was going on with great interest. And I must say, watching Jerry uh, on YouTube and his presentations, he was one of the few people in the world who has as big a personality as my dad. I would say I've met a few, maybe on several fingers of one hand, who as big a personality as my father was, and he was clearly one. And so that he got it was not surprising to me when I saw him do his work, when I saw him give talks.
So you were invited to be involved with the trial or as college,
I
but
actually was not in. I was not specifically invited. I got to say,
okay.
no, no, I was not specifically invited. Would I have gone? I probably would have out of curiosity. Also, because Jerry was a famous guy and would have been very interesting to meet him. And I have worked with lawyers on. I also I've done expert witness work, so it would have been really fun to talk to Jerry about that. Um, but no, it was never actually there.
Before I go have Chris ask the next question, this one might ruffle some feathers, not yours. What is the quality of some of the so-called best psychodramatists out there? And is psychodrama going in the right direction right now in terms of how it's practiced and how it's taught?
Well, what's important, well, it was a real problem for my dad getting into the 1960s because so many people were doing, as you know, you guys are of a certain age as well, who were doing encounter groups and sensitivity training. There was some crazy stuff going on. And many of these people, especially out in the Bay Area in San Francisco, were calling what they were doing psychodrama. And some of what they're doing was really bad. So it developed, I think, in some quarters, a bad reputation. My father was not a guy who would start like certification programs, but finally in the 1970s, people said we have to have proper training so that we can distinguish the people who are legit from the people who are not. And now there is what's called an American Board of Examiners that give certification. So anybody with the sound of my voice or the view of my image, if you're interested in psychodrama for psychotherapy or just to hear about it, or to get some kind of a counselor or advisor, I would make sure that they are certified as a psychodrama practitioner. Those people, I think, are very well qualified. But this was a problem in the 1960s. Um, can I add one thing to that? I have just been totally transfixed the last few nights by a documentary series about Synanon. If you haven't seen it, urge you to watch it. Complicated story. Chris, have you seen
I
it?
did, and I was thinking exactly when you mentioned the Bay Area about how
Yeah,
just like Jim Jones, things started out in a really good direction, and oh boy, did they
they go
just
wrong. Yeah.
slide into a bad place.
So there's Chuck Diederich was an alcoholic. I'm just going to summarize this for people who aren't familiar with Synanon, who in the late 1950s realized that drug addicts, not necessarily alcoholics, but people who are IV drug users or whatever, that they could benefit from a related but different approach from the 12 steps of AA. So he started an organization called Synanon, which was a kind of a mashup of different terms that somebody used. Um, and the core concept, which I'm giving the game away here for those of you who haven't watched the documentary, was something called the game. And the game was essentially an encounter group, you might say. But in the game, in Chuck Diedrich's game, you could say anything to anybody else in the group that you wanted to, as long as it wasn't threatening violence. It became violent, as Chris knows, toward the end, but you could say anything you want. The difference between what Diederich was doing and he definitely was inspired by psychotrauma, there's no question. The mistake he made was that, if I'm gonna yell at Chris, John, Chris, you're a schmuck, can't stand you. And then, well, in psychodrama, it's okay, now become Chris. What do you want to say to Jonathan? And how do you feel about what he said to you? Right? So he didn't do the role reversal. So it became, if you just do a one way, a game, as they called it, that's very destructive. And you could see inevitably, Chris, I'm sure you could see this because you know the TLC, you have the experience. You can see where this was going. And Diederik, now I will say one other thing, if I might, about Chuck Diederik, the founder of Synanon. Lou Yablonsky, who was one of my father's favorite students, and I loved Lou. He was a sociologist and psychodramatist, famous guy. Becomes a hero, by the way, at the end of that fourth episode.
Mhm.
Um, Lou was fascinated by Synanon. He went in to write a book about Synanon, the first one called The Tunnel Back. He was very sympathetic in the beginning. In 1967, my parents were in a conference in LA. Chuck Diederik and Lou Yablonsky are sitting with a biker, a Hells Angel guy. Chuck was surrounded by Hells Angels. They were his security force at that time. And my father comes in looking crazily eccentric with my mother, 28 years younger. And the Hells Angels guy says, "Look at that crazy guy." And Chuck Diederik says, "That crazy guy is the reason you're alive now."
Wow.
So, Synanon did not have a good end, but it had a good start.
Mm. Chris, you're next.
Yeah, so Jonathan, I was curious, your book Impromptu Man, J.L. Moreno and the Origins of Psychodrama and Counterculture and the Social Network. Looks like you wrote that around 2014 or was published then.
Yeah.
The process of doing that and going that deep and examining your dad's work, and I'm guessing your mom's too. As I said, I'll confess that I have not had the pleasure yet, but it is definitely going to be in my shelf. Um, uh, did you learn anything new, and did you develop any insights from doing that deep dive
Yeah.
that you'd like to share?
That's a good question. So I don't really write about my mom, I will say. She was still alive at the time. She wrote her own memoir. Uh,
Hmm.
I was interested in JL, and I called him JL in the book rather than Dad, because I wanted, look, I was already approaching the age that he was when I was born. And I did not know him, if you think about it, really for the first 70 years. I mean, I was 7 years old when he was 70, right? So you think about your own parents, when did you really get to know them as people or appreciate that they were independent people and and assess them? So I didn't really know him for the first 70 years of his life, which is really weird, right?
Yeah.
So and I was also approaching the senior period of my career. How did this guy think about his career? How did he develop? They in the 30s in America, they called it climb up the ladder, right? The ladder of success. We don't use that term anymore, but that's the way they talked about it then. How did he climb the ladder? How did he understand what he was doing and get into the culture the way he did? So I developed, I think, a perspective on him as a guy who was making his way in a new land, in a new world.
Mhm.
And before, so he came in 25, the big influx of European intellectuals and scholars and scientists was 10 years later, 10, 15 years later. So he was early. He was before the big wave. And he was very exotic. You can imagine, with the accent. In America in the 1930s, there weren't too many people like that. So I'm sure he attracted a lot of attention because of his very theatrical manner and his accent. And, he was a psychiatrist, and it must have been quite striking. So I think the short answer that I should give you is I tried to see him in the book as somebody who was making his way in America in the middle of the 20th century. And one of the ways he did that was through boxing. I mean, he became a boxing fan and, an observer of the dynamic of people in the ring. So, yeah, I mean, I will share with you that while I was writing the book, you may remember that the Republican Convention in 1912, showing my age, in 2012, Clint Eastwood took the stage
Mhm.
with an empty chair. And I said, "Oh my God, this is unbelievable." So I went to bed. This is totally true. And after about 10 minutes, I said, I've got to write something. And I wrote something, and that night I sent it to the New York Times. And the next morning, typos and all, they accepted it. Shocked. And it's on my wall over here. They gave it the title, I'm looking at it now, What the Chair Could Have Told Clint. Because, he's yelling at Obama in the empty chair, but he's not reversing roles with Obama.
Yeah.
From his point of view. So New York Times, and I got a lot of mail, 99% of it very, very nice. And one woman wrote to me and the editor of the Times, this is the nicest thing that anybody's ever said to me, I think, about a piece of writing. This reminds me why I subscribe to the New York Times. God bless him.
Wow.
Yeah. But I will say, where did Clint Eastwood get that idea? He got it from psychodrama.
Yeah.
Not directly, but people like Woody Allen, Alan Alda, what's it, Don Knotts? Remember him?
Sure.
Mayberry, the deputy.
Orange Five.
I don't think they had psychodrama on the Andy Griffith Show, though.
No, but they learned how to play roles spontaneously. They went to my father's psychodrama in New York. They all did in the early 60s. Yeah. Woody Allen, as a matter of record. I mean, a former editor of the Village Voice wrote about Woody Allen going to psychodrama. And my mother remembered him, very annoyed with him because he wasn't taking it seriously at an emotional level. He was in clearly developing his role, not really being part of the psychodrama, playing himself.
Wow. The name of this show is Beat the Prosecution. Jonathan, to what extent have you worked with lawyers, and what has been your involvement in helping patients, if you have that licensing or whatever you call it, to help patients or whoever else go through psychodrama, and of course you've taught psychodrama, and to what extent have you been doing that?
So I have not taught psychodrama or led groups since I was in my mid-30s. I decided it wasn't for me. No problem with it, but it wasn't that lifestyle, that role, that career wasn't for me. I said earlier, in the beginning, right, of the show, I came through the birth canal. I didn't volunteer for this, as far as I know. Maybe in some Buddhist sense, I did, right? That's a different question. Right, exactly. Go, John. Buddhism's really the only way, right? Ultimately. So, but I have noticed how it has penetrated the culture from this perspective, including medical education. I mean, in medical education, there is role playing with patients, with people who are playing the roles of patients, to sensitize them to the medical setting and to what they will be doing as doctors. I have been an expert on. I've been deposed more than 40 times. I've had some fascinating cases. I will say that what really interests me, and some of them have come through your colleagues, the people who've gone through the Trial Lawyers College. What's sort of fascinating to me about you guys is the different ways that lawyers prepare their experts. It can be very different. The way that the management of expert witnesses is another topic I find quite fascinating. There are some people who come at me with their theory of the case, right? Which I resist because I want to develop my own view. And then there are some people who are kind of pretty straightforward about it. There's this, there's that. We haven't finished our discovery yet, and so forth. So I find the role of the expert in itself quite fascinating. Some of you guys will prepare experts better than others, as you probably know. Sometimes the great lawyer will not do well in a deposition against an expert because they're not prepared. Preparation is absolutely key. So that's been my experience. And I have done lots of informed consent cases involving clinical trials, and then some other cases where my wife, who by the way is a lawyer, uh, has said to me, "What do they need you to say that a doctor shouldn't have sex with his patients?" I don't understand. Why are you being paid for this? Because this lawyer in North Carolina says that, according to their rules, they need an expert to say that. So,
Jonathan, if I could jump in just to say, since you're talking about that, knowing who John's audience is, for Beat the Prosecution, that what kind of things could you share with us that the good lawyers did to help you be a better expert? Because there's lots of us that have to do just that.
I'm going to say, Chris, time for preparation.
Mm,
Don't put the expert in a position where there's something that comes up in the deposition they don't know about. I have had that experience. I had a case maybe 12, 15 years ago where a lawyer threw a lot of stuff at me at the last minute. I mean, in those days, I had two suitcases of documents that I rolled in.
mm,
Uh,
wow.
and as soon as the lawyer for the other side, who was a very nice fellow, by the way, uh, looked at those suitcases full of documents, he asked me, Professor Moreno, how long have you had those documents? And I said, about 3 days. That was the worst. The lawyer was a very senior guy, but he was too busy, and who knows what else he was working on. So don't let me be surprised. Don't give me everything you've got. I actually insist on that, and I think that's the key
Thank you.
as an expert.
While we have about 6 minutes left, to what extent have you worked with patients or subjects yourself to help them out using psychodrama?
So I have been very hesitant, even when I was really doing psychodrama, John, to present myself as a therapist because I'm not a psychologist. Of no clinical background per se. Um, what I did was I worked with trainers, and I felt very comfortable doing that, training the trainers, because I knew all the techniques so well, and I knew variations on themes that I had seen in psychodrama since I was a kid. I mean, there were some situations, I will say, this is sort of to Chris's question before, that I should not have been in growing up. Uh, I'm going to tell you one last story. When I was about 12 years old, I was somehow in the psychodrama theater with some patients and some students. And there was a woman, maybe in her 40s, late 40s, 50, who was playing herself and she was in a bar. She wanted to talk about a situation she'd been in a bar not long before that. And she chose me to be a man sitting next to her in the bar. And I was about 12 years old. And we reversed roles. And as the man sitting in the bar, the director said to her, sitting now as the man in the bar, what do you think about this lady? And playing this man, she looked at me and said, I'd like to, you can fill in the blank, her. That's true. True story. And I remember she had a very pixie-ish kind of hairdo and, nice looking lady. And I sort of knew what she was talking about, but I sort of didn't. So I used a line that she had given me when I was in the role of the man. I said, I'm in accounting. What do you do?
Wow.
So fortunately, whoever was directing the psychodrama at that moment said, I think we should get another person to play that guy's role. Yeah.
Well, how about your input on this then, Jonathan? Sometimes we lawyers, without a psychodrama expert, at least without a mental health expert, will do role playing and reverse role playing with our clients, whether we call it scene reenactment to play it safe. Where do you think we should draw the line to make sure that our clients not then going home afterwards and
Right.
going into an emotional tailspin?
Super important question. I think there's a difference between working at the psychological level in an individual for an individual situation and working at a role level. So when you're in a role, play mom, play dad, play the boss, play the employee, play the lawyer for one side, play the lawyer for the other side, play the judge, play the witness. Keep it at a at a sociological level, not at an individualized level where you're getting into their own dynamics, their personal, deepest psychological dynamics. That may be hard to avoid. I'm going to grant you that, John. But I think you have to be very careful to draw the line. You're their counselor in a legal sense. You're not their therapist. And I think that's really critical. Don't take responsibility for their deepest personal problems. You're kind of help them work through what might be a very traumatic situation, obviously, right? Nobody goes to you because everything's going well, right? Uh, and I appreciate that, but somehow you have to, I think it's going to be individualized, draw the line between becoming their therapist and being their counselor and advisor in terms of the law and their presentation in the court, of course.
As we're just around 4, I want to connect this into Chris Flora in his own way as one of these people who has taken psychodrama to a great level to really help out himself and so many of our colleagues in getting closer to the win. Chris, what do you think about that? And what else do you want to ask Jonathan? You're going to have the last question of him.
Well, thanks. It was at Don's encouragement, and John was the forefront. He was the very first leader of the local groups when he was still practicing out of Maryland. And we got so much out of that. Our classmates was a very small group. We limited it to only people at that time that were trial lawyers, college grads. And it was hard to get momentum. We're all busy and so forth. And I become closer to Don through that group. I didn't really work with him much out in '99. We were at the same place for a month, and I probably saw him a half a dozen times. But John, here has been an important part of my, group. We meet every second Saturday at my office, and sometimes we have a psychodramatist, that's leading. Sometimes we don't. But it's been really helpful to be in the role of a director, which is a totally different skill. And I just have to say, I'm so humbled and grateful to be in this conversation today because, I am in debt to your dad. And I'm glad that you wrote the book because lots of people, when both John and I introduced this concept, we just get a shrug, shoulder shrug, like, what? And I say, if you want to see a version of it, watch Billy Jack. It's the only movie that has a scene in it that you can hear the word psychodrama.
Yeah, he uses the word psychodrama. I almost fell off my chair. And when did that come out? 1968 or 69?
Early 70s.
Yeah,
early 70s. Yeah,
early 70s. Yep, I've got the poster up on my wall. But
that's hilarious.
John has got a good, since he gave me the last question, I'm going to copy from him that usually he ends this podcast with, is there anything that we didn't get to ask you that you would like to share with the group, or something that, since we're largely a group of lawyers listening to this podcast, but some non, and you've worked with a bunch of us, is there anything that you would like to share with us before we close out?
Well, I would say if you've got something like Don Clarkson running a group, you've got a great therapist. That's different from you working with a client in a typical legal setting. And when you've got a bunch of people getting together in your groups who are prepared for what they're going to experience, which is a true psychological exploration through psychodrama, and you've got Don Clarkson, you're in great shape. So I would say one needs to distinguish, your legal client you don't want that person to go home and think that you're their therapist.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I mean to say, not to discourage people from using psychodrama in their preparation for the legal work when you've got someone like Don Clarkson and everybody understand what the situation is. I think that's where I would distinguish between being the counselor, being the therapist, and being the colleague with a great therapist like Don.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And what is your last word, Chris?
Oh, I have none, just gratitude. just gratitude. Yeah,
Well,
this
I
is
want to, Chris, I want to hear from you after you read the book. I want to get,
absolutely. No, no, I have your email address now, thanks to John's office. So I'm gonna get that going quick, and I would love to follow up with you. Thank you for that.
thank you.
Before I sign off, I think most all of us have heard about Jael Moreno in our psychology classes in high school, in college, and for those of you who are not mental health professionals who don't know anything about psychodrama other than what you've heard about today, read Jonathan's book, Absolutely Essential, for instance. And for those mental health professionals among you, where I ask you, what do you think about psychodrama? And you give me a blank stare that you've heard about it. Learn more about it, please. And that book is absolutely essential, right, Jonathan?
The new book, thank you for mentioning, John, is about a whole other topic, which is the international situation, the rules-based order for the last 80 years since World War II that's prevented World War III, that is now undergoing drastic change, and a perspective on what's going on globally. It's published by MIT Press. So that's my latest preoccupation is that little book.
Do you have a book about psychodrama?
The book is called Impromptu Man, Chris mentioned.
That's the one, Impromptu
That's the
Man.
that's the one about my dad, my attempt to reconstruct his career.
And finally, do you have a URL, a website?
Uh, I don't at the moment, but you can go to the Penn website. I'm still on the Penn Medical Ethics and Health Policy website, or you can just write to me. If somebody wants to get my email address, they could write to you, John, perhaps.
John at beattheprosecution.com. Yes. Well, like with so many of my amazing guests, I don't want to stop, but I told you both I'd finish at 4, and we're a little past then. You have heard from Jonathan Moreno, what a gift he has given us. You have heard from Christopher Floor, who is a true gift not only to his colleagues, but to mankind, and I don't exaggerate there. This is John Katz at Beat the Prosecution. I'm a criminal defense and DUI defense lawyer in Northern Virginia. I thank these two men so much. Thank you.